I am working from home today, so if you hear a little bit of background noise, that might be my dogs scuttering around. But they're laying down now, so we should have no issues. So today we're going to talk about preventing slip, trip, and fall, as well as overexertion injuries. These are two of some of the most costly types of injuries and claims that we see come in year after year, regardless of industry. So my name's John.Valentine. I'm a safety and risk consultant with York and CareWorks. All right, sorry, I had the wrong window clicked there. There we go. So we're going to talk about slips, trips, and falls first. And actually, I'm missing a slide here. There it is. So a little bit about me first. I'm originally from Pennsylvania. I now work both domestically and internationally. I've worked on site with clients in 40 states, in 5 countries under a lot of different regulations. A little bit of background, I started out with Zachary Engineering, did safety and industrial hygiene with them, as well as Marathon Petroleum for a while. Then probably my first big project was being a health and safety coordinator on a pipeline construction project in Southwest Pennsylvania. After that, I got into consulting. I've been consulting now for about 3 years. I teach fall protection and confined space are kind of my 2 big topics that I kind of travel all over the place teaching for large companies. Um, and outside of that, I do still work a lot with insurance groups as well, particularly in Ohio and Washington. So today I know most of you are from some of our Ohio groups and non-group insurance business. However, I know there's also some of you from outside of Ohio because we did advertise this on LinkedIn and to some of our clients outside of the Ohio area. So wherever you're watching from, thanks for tuning in today. So again, we're going to talk about slips, trips, and falls first, and then overexertions a little bit later. I kind of separated them apart a little bit. With slip, trips, and falls, we'll start with the definitions of what that means. And actually, before I get to that, I know we just had about 20 more people just kind of slipped in there on me. For those of you that just joined, there is a chat box that should be on the right side of your screen. And in there, you'll be able to type a chat message and I'll be able to see it live. I will pause every once in a while to answer some of those questions as they come up. All right, so back to the presentation. So with the definitions, we'll start with the slip. So slip's just when you have too little friction or traction between your feet and your footwear and the walking working surface. You lose your balance, and that ultimately is going to result in you falling, and that is where we start to see the injuries is due to that fall. A lot of people think that slips and trips aren't that big of a deal. You're on the same walking working surface. You're not falling very far. But what a lot of people fail to realize is your head is falling depending on how tall you are. So if you're a 6-foot tall person, your head is falling and building up force over 6 feet until it hits the ground. So if you don't have your hands out in front of you to catch yourself, these types of slips and trips can be just as dangerous as falling off a ladder as far as head injuries go. Trips then are very similar, only that's going to be where your foot or your lower leg hits an object and your upper body keeps moving. And again, if you're 6 feet tall, your head is going to be falling 6 feet. Christine just asked, will these slides be available to you after the presentation? Yes, they will be. You'll actually be able to come to this link and rewatch this video as many times as you want. So I won't be sending out the actual slides, but this video will be up and left up for you to access at any time through this same link. All right. Another way people trip is also stepping down to a lower surface and losing their balance. You see that on stairways. I was actually notorious as a child for falling while going up the stairs. So that is a thing as well. So anytime you have a level change, you have the risk of a trip as well. And then the fall, that occurs when your body's too far off its center of balance. That could be caused by a slip. That could be caused by a trip. Or it could be caused by you leaning over something like a guardrail, and then you fall after your center of gravity gets over that guardrail. A lot of people don't realize that your center of gravity is the whole way up in your chest. It's not, a lot of people think it's around your belly button. For most people, that's not the case. For most people, your center of gravity is up in your upper chest area, and that's because your head is one of the 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 heaviest parts of your body. I was going to say dense, but I realized the joke that was in there. So, all right, there's two types of falls. There's going to be falls at the same level. That's going to be your slips and trips, which we just talked about. And then there are falls to a lower level. Those are typically your more dangerous ones. The falls to a lower level are more likely to result in very serious injuries as well as fatalities. You can still have serious injuries and fatalities with falls at the same level, though. Don't think that you can't. Falls to a lower level, that's going to be when you're working on a surface higher up, like on a ladder or maybe on the first floor of a building, and then you're going to fall to a lower floor or a lower level of scaffolding or something like that. With those falls at the same level, I did mention those can be fatal as well. If any of you know or have heard of Dr. Atkins, had the Atkins diet back in, I think that was like the 80s or 90s. That was actually his cause of death. He was walking, tripped on a curb on a sidewalk, fell and hit his head. The cause of death was epidural hematoma. So because of that blunt impact force to his head. So again, making sure we have our hands out in front of us when we're walking is important as well. I can't tell you how many times I see people with their left hand in their pocket and their phone in their right hand right in front of their face. When they fall or they trip, their hand gets stuck in their pocket, and what do they do with their phone? They lift it up as high as they can because they don't want their phone to hit the ground. So their face is what ends up catching them during a fall. So that's another thing to watch out for, especially in the workplace, especially in office type buildings, is folks walking around with their hands in their pockets or a phone in one hand, the other hand in their pocket. They have nothing to catch themselves with if they trip. Slips and falls, this is according to the National Floor Safety Institute, are the leading cause of workers' compensation claims, as well as the leading cause of occupational injury for people that are aged 15 to 24. So your younger workers, these are the leading cause of claims for them. Okay. They're also the primary cause of lost days from work. Lost days from work tend to be what makes claims extremely expensive. When folks are losing work, they're pulling on that workers' compensation for their wages, and it just balloons the value of a claim on top of the medical that's already there. Slips, trips, and falls accounted for 26% of the total occupational injuries and illnesses in 2016. So you can think of hundreds of different things that cause injuries in the workplace. 26% of them were due to slips, trips, and falls, which all get categorized together. And the BLS, that's the Bureau of Labor and Statistics at the U.S. government. So those are the numbers for all 50 states. So that averages out across all of those. 22% of all accidental deaths are due to falls. When we talk about accidental deaths, that's not just within industry. So this is also including injuries at home as well. So 22% of all accidental deaths are falls, and that is the second leading cause behind motor vehicles. There were 33,381 deaths in 2016 alone due to people falling accidentally. They're one of the most frequently reported injuries in industry. Again, they're about 25% of the reported claims every year that we see come in. And over 17% of all disabling injuries result from falls. So that's where we start to see permanent or partial disability for our workers. 17% of those cases are due to falls. Most of the others are going to be your motor vehicle accidents and your amputations. So those three things kind of make up most of the disabling injuries: slips, trips, falls, amputations, and motor vehicle accidents. And when you have a disabling occupational injury, now you're looking at settlements, you're looking at payouts and things like that that start to get extremely expensive, and then ultimately drive your premium through the roof for a couple of years. And if you're in a group rating system, it could cause you to get kicked out of group if your performance gets too poor due to a couple of bad injuries that result in paralysis or disabilities. The good news is most of these injuries, all these ones up above here, those 33,000 deaths in 2016, the 25% of claims reported every year, most of those can be prevented. if we work on the front end to keep them from happening, to help control the environment and to help make employees more aware, which is what we're going to talk about today. Whoops, I thought I took this slide out. It snuck in on me. So I'll go over it anyway. There were 849 workplace fatalities in 2016. That was 17% of all the fatalities in 2016. Some of you may wonder why I'm using numbers from 2016. That's the last time really that we had a big outpouring of data from both the BLS and the Liberty Mutual also does a big survey every couple of years that gives us some of these statistics summarized. So that's why we're using numbers from 2016. They're really the most recent ones that are available right now. There were 229,000 cases with days away from work due to slips, trips, and falls in the US. 33% of those resulted in more than 31 days away from work. So that's getting extremely expensive when you're talking about paying workers' comp for someone that's off of work for a month or longer. And that was 33% of the slip and fall incidents in 2016 of those 229,000 cases with days away from work. Typical injuries due to slips, trips, and falls. The body parts that are going to be affected are going to be obviously your knees, your ankles, your foots. We see a lot of people that are twisting knees and ankles due to a trip. So we see that more with trips. Also, sometimes with slips, they get a little bit of a weird bodily reaction as they turn their body a goofy way as they're falling as well. Wrists and elbows while they're trying to catch themselves as they fall. You'll see some compound fractures here. This is when we start to get into some fairly serious injuries with compound fractures and things like that at the wrist and elbow area, especially with the elderly or for folks who have bone development issues. Back injuries, we see that more with the falls from ladders or falls to a lower level. We don't see quite as many back injuries from slips and trips unless they are twisting as they fall. Then we could start to see some more back injuries there. Shoulder injuries, again, while they're trying to catch themselves or if they fall on their shoulder. Hip injuries, extremely common with our older workers as well during those falls. And then obviously, we already talked about head injuries. If you're 6 feet tall and you slip or trip, your head is falling 6 feet until it hits something unless your hands are out in front of you to catch yourself. In the same respect, if you're 6 feet up on a ladder or you're 10 feet up on a platform, when you fall, your head is 6 feet above where you're standing. So if you're 10 feet up on a platform, your head is falling 16 feet. And typically you're going to fall head first because again, your center of gravity is in your chest. As you start to lean over an edge, you're going to start to fall head first and rotate as you fall. Okay. And then some more injuries. I know I didn't mention some of these. Abrasions and cuts, which are minor. Bruises and contusions, which are minor. The sprains and strains, you start to get into time off and things like that. Fractures, now you're starting to get into major injuries. We do see compound fractures as well as concussions and head trauma. That's where you really start to get into the lost time as well as medical treatment costs. Okay. The common causes, so the things we want to make sure that we're keeping under control as we're going through our workplace and doing evaluations of our working surfaces. What is the composition of your floor? So how much slip resistance does the floor have when it's dry and properly cleaned? And does that floor stay dry and properly cleaned throughout the workday? You know, if I'm working in some sort of food processing facility where I have a lot of water all over the place all the time, that floor is not going to be dry when people are working on it. So that's something to keep in mind. So if your floor is typically dry, you want to know what the slip resistance is when it's dry. If it's typically wet, you want to know what that slip resistance is when it's typically wet, if that's what your workers are going to be dealing with. And then you have to control it beyond that, whether that be adding mats or better drainage, things like that. Some hard surface floors are going to be slip resistant when they're dry, but extremely slippery when wet. Think about certain types of tile there. Not only that, but I know we do have some folks from the fast food and the restaurant industry with us today. I worked in a kitchen for years when I was in high school and college. Those floors get extremely slippy due to grease, and then you go to mop the floor with water and it makes it even slippier. So that's another thing to think about is how you're cleaning your floors Are you using the appropriate cleaners with them? Are you using a degreaser for your greasy floors rather than using a regular water and soap? Okay, foreign substances, I just mentioned grease, as well as ice and water. Those are your major contributors to hazardous floors. Um, and if you're using dirty, greasy mop water, a lot of times that's going to make it worse. So typically a no-touch cleaning system or a mop bucket, excuse me, that has separate compartments for clean and dirty water. That way you're not continually just bringing that dirty water back out onto the floor that contains grease and everything else that you were trying to get off the floor. Surface conditions. Do you have any raised or recessed edges? If you do, are they clearly marked? Are they visible? Can people see them readily? Loose carpeting, make sure you don't have any of that. At your front doors, where you enter a building, a lot of times, especially in the winter, we'll lay down some extra carpeting or mats for people to rub their feet off with. It's almost inevitable that by the end of the day, it gets rolled in a corner and creates a big trip hazard. So make sure you're securing those extra mats to the floor if you have a problem with them rolling up. If they're staying flat for you all the time, not a big deal. Okay. Surface changes. I talked about this as a kid. I told you I fell going up the stairs. Surface changes. People that are especially in a hurry are not paying good attention. They're going to trip while they're going up or down stairs. They're also going to trip while they're going from one floor surface to another. So going from carpeted to tile can cause someone to trip if you don't have a good transition there, or if it's not very well lit to know that they're changing floor surfaces, especially if they're not wearing good shoes for friction control, because if once they get over that tile floor, if they have a slippery type shoe, they could end up slipping there as well. So just make sure you keep those transition areas. You know, it's inevitable. We're going to have those. Make sure they're well lit and try to make sure there's not much of a raised surface change there either. Try to keep them level with each other. Okay. And that rolls right into the next one. Level changes. Unexpected slopes in the floor or raises in the top 3 steps can contribute to accidents. Real quick, I'll answer this one question that came in. Natasha said she'd like to present this to additional staff in her organization. Absolutely feel free. You paid for access to this. Feel free to distribute this link to your employees. That is perfectly fine. Also, those of you that are here for BWC 2-hour credit in the state of Ohio, if you have more than one company, each company has to pay its own fee in order to get that sent over to the BWC for credit. So if you just have one company, that's great. Share it with all your employees. But if you have more than one company and you're doing this for BWC credit, make sure you register both companies with us. And if you know that you need to do that and didn't do that, don't worry. You can still go back to that registration link. It's going to stay up because, again, we're keeping this video up. So anyone can register at any time as well. So, but if you're just sharing it with employees in your own company, that's fine. You don't need to register. Again, just give them the link. All right, some more common causes. We have a couple more here. So obstructions, if you have extension cords, hoses, or even wet floor signs, that can start to make for an unsafe obstacle course. We see this a lot in construction sites. So I do a lot of audits for construction sites, and I am a huge nitpicker on extension cords and hoses that are not neatly run along the wall where they need to go, and instead they're drug out across floors and making big trip hazards. And wet floor signs are probably my biggest pet peeve. A lot of times I see people that just come out and, you know, it's not my job to clean it up. So they just sit the wet floor sign there and walk away and don't even tell anybody. If you put the wet floor sign up, you're saying we know there's a problem here. So that wet floor sign is just administrative control to get you by for just a couple of minutes till whoever's responsibility it is to clean that up gets there and cleans it up. So make sure that happens quickly. And then once it's clean and dry, you can leave your floor sign up for a little bit, but take it down once it's clean and dry. I myself have tripped over wet floor signs, and I will admit it was of my own ignorance because I was walking on my cell phone like I shouldn't be. I think just about everyone's guilty of that at some point or another. So again, my biggest pet peeves: get those wet floors cleaned up and the sign put away, and don't walk around with your hands in your pockets and your other hand holding your phone looking at it, because that's how accidents happen. And I have been on the receiving end of those accidents before myself. You got to learn somehow, right? Visibility. Make sure that you have good lighting, that you don't have a lot of glare and shadows. This is kind of one of the lesser options for a common cause. It does help reduce slips and trips, though. Just think about walking through a fairly dark environment. You tend to be really careful with your feet because you can't see anything, and you still end up tripping over something. So I don't know if anyone's ever walked through the woods in the evening. I used to hunt back when I lived in Pennsylvania, and when there's poor lighting, even with a flashlight, you end up tripping over everything that's there because it is very hard to see due to the glare and the shadows. Okay. And then human factors. This is kind of where everything culminates, is typically with all these other causes, there's also some human factor involved. So people have different physical abilities, physical challenges, as well as shoe types and familiarity with the area. And also throw age into there, because you do start to lose your balance as you get older. Also, your bones tend to be a little more fragile as you get older. So we do see more bone type injuries with our older employees. That's not to say the younger employees don't get hurt as well. They can also have bone type injuries, but a lot more times with them we see the sprains and strains a little bit more with the younger employees. We also see a quicker bounce back with younger employees because their bodies heal a little faster. So you want to be extra cautious if you do have an older workforce, which in the tri-state area, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, we do have an aging workforce in that area of the country right now. Again, being extra careful, extra cautious, and extra aware of who our workforce is and how we need to make sure that we're reminding them of the hazards around them. All right. Falls from stairs, we typically see the most injuries aside from ladders. Again, because you're falling down to a lower level and you're hitting multiple platforms on the way down. So stairs do tend to result in some of the most serious injuries. Nobody should be using stairs while they're carrying something with both their hands. Anytime an employee is on a staircase, they should have at least one hand on a handrail. That is actually a requirement directly from OSHA. I don't care what they do in their own home, but if they're in the workplace, they need to be using those handrails. When I worked in the refineries, we saw more injuries in the corporate office than we did in the refineries, and it was simply because of hazard awareness. Out in a refinery, folks know what the hazards are, they know things are dangerous, but back in the office, people aren't thinking about danger around every corner like they are in the refineries. And so you'll have someone in an office in high heels carrying a box and decide to take the stairs. So we just added two really dangerous things together there: heels on stairs and carrying a box downstairs. So if you have to carry something that takes both your hands, take the elevator. Um, and make sure that anytime you are on stairs, you're using a handrail. Unusual features or anything that could distract someone who's walking around, like loud noises, strobe or flashing light. Again, that's typically, I don't see that in a typical work environment outside of construction. And in construction, it's there. Um, I don't really see this as being too big of a deal for most people. But if you do have something that could be distracting to someone who's walking around on a surface, it might be a good idea not to have that somewhere that has trip hazards as well. Put it somewhere out in the open. Some general requirements. So this is a perfect example of what I said. I used to work in kitchens for a long time. I worked in the fast food industry when I was in high school. This was a common sight, and nobody really took the time to clean it up, especially during our busy periods. There is nothing slippier than an already greasy floor with soapy water on top of it, and then on top of that, you're smashing French fries into it. You will go sliding quick. Those of you working in the restaurant industry, non-slip shoes are huge for you, but also the grease that ends up on your floor, especially for the folks working in the fryer and broiler areas, it eats away at the tread on their shoes. So within a year, their non-slip shoes are now the slippiest thing you've ever seen. They have no tread left on them because they've been eaten away by that warm grease that's on the floor. So it's really important to make sure you're keeping those floors clean, and also keeping up with your employees, making sure that if their non-slip shoes are no longer non-slip, that you're making them get new ones. And I always strongly encourage you to assist employees in purchasing non-slip shoes because it's in your favor. What's cheaper, spending $30 on a pair of shoes for an employee or spending a couple $1,000s or more because that employee slips and gets injured? All right. So with housekeeping, make sure you have an effective process to clean up spills immediately. Again, you can go put that sign out there that says wet floor, but somebody needs to go out there shortly after and actually get it cleaned up. And then once it's clean and dried, take that sign down because that sign again is a trip hazard because we all know kids these days and adults as well, myself included, you can catch just about any person walking around with one hand in their pocket and their phone in front of their face, and they're never going to see that sign, and they're going to walk right over it. And we also have heard of the folks who go out and look for opportunities to do that on purpose to make some money. Again, that's more on the civil liability end than it is on your workers' comp end, but it's still risk management. So it's something that needs to be talked about. An effective process to mitigate leaks or other causes of slippery floors or walkways, especially if you have a sink area where you're doing a lot of dishes or something like that. Um, Anywhere you're expected to have a slippery floor, make sure you have a process to mitigate leaks or causes for that. If you have any construction areas, any aisles, any stairs, any ramps, any runways, corridors, office shops, storage areas, anywhere where work is going to be permitted, those just happen to be the areas that OSHA has written in their standard. But really, anywhere in your workplace where there's going to be work in progress, it needs to be well lit and the floor needs to be free of debris. So if anything ends up on the floor, I know a lot of people are just like, oh, that's not my job, and they leave it there. Safety is everybody's job. So if there's something that's a trip hazard, it's everybody's job to make sure that that trip hazard gets fixed. Whether they do it themselves or they report it to a supervisor to get fixed, it needs to get handled before someone gets hurt. And these are the simple things to take care of. Okay. So your aisles, your passageways, and your travel lanes, your hallways, things like that, make sure they're clear and that you move obstructions that could create a hazard. Perfect example, an extension cord laying around, very similar to this. Okay. Make sure that you mark permanent aisles and passageways. That's more important for your warehouse type areas. So if you have somewhere where workers are expected, pedestrian traffic is expected to walk, but you also might have forklift traffic and things like that, make sure that the pedestrian aisles and passageways are marked as such. And aisles need to be wide enough anywhere that you have mechanical handling equipment used. And again, that's speaking mostly to warehouses, yards, and things like that, where you have some more heavy work going on, some vehicles moving around. Also, anytime you're on a ladder or getting in or out of a vehicle that is raised up, so those of you that are in the construction industry, in agriculture, or that have forklifts, anytime you're climbing in and out of that vehicle or you're climbing on a ladder, you must have 3 points of contact while you're climbing on that ladder or on and off trucks and equipment. Okay, that being said, you are allowed to work on a temporary ladder without 3 points of contact. Let me give you an example. Use 3 points of contact while you climb a folding temporary ladder because you're going to change a light bulb. You have to reach up with both hands to get those long style light bulbs out of the ballast. Okay, and then you'll pull that light bulb down out of the ballast. And that takes both your hands. But you're not climbing the ladder at that point. You're just doing work and you're making sure you're centered under it while you're doing that. And then I don't want you to climb down that ladder with that light bulb in your hand. You should hand that long light bulb off to someone who's standing down below you. That way you can now use 3 points of contact while climbing back down off that ladder. Okay. And again, as I said before, always use handrails when you're on stairs. Always, always, always. Okay. Speaking of ladders, okay, ladder injuries and deaths are very common across all sectors. This is where we start to get into some more serious injuries because now we're falling from a height when we're on a ladder. Okay, a lot of times the incident is due to user error and not a defective ladder. This first image down here, this guy standing on 3 buckets. We obviously can't do that in the workplace. If you need a ladder, get a ladder. Do not stand on a rolling chair. Do not stand on a couple of buckets. Some of you might be laughing, thinking that would never happen. I'm telling you, if I'm saying it, I've seen it. I was at an apartment building that was under construction in Columbus, Ohio. That is not where this picture was taken, but I do have a picture of one of my clients standing on just 2 buckets, not 3. This guy in this picture is actually quite talented. I don't know how he got up on 3 buckets. But he was standing on 2 buckets in order to reach behind a water heater that he was setting up. And the worst part about it was within the frame of the picture that I took at that job site, there was a 4-step ladder just 3 or 4 feet away from him. But he chose to use the 2 buckets that must have just been a little bit closer. Um, so again, use a ladder when a ladder is called for. This image in the middle, that is showing us a ladder that has a defective rung. It's been damaged. You can see a slight bend in that third rung on your screen, which he's about to step onto. I doubt that rung would fail, but what could happen is because it's not level the whole way across, because it's bent, when he brings his other foot down, he's going to expect there to be a rung where there's not because it's bent down a couple inches. And he could miss his footing and fall backwards. Yes, Donna, it happens way more than we realize. And then this other one over here on the right, this fella is reaching outside of the rails of the ladder. The old kind of term was keep your belt buckle between the rails, which would be around your waist or your belly button area, which this guy's doing. His belt buckle is just barely between those rails. However, that is, I mean, you can just look at this picture. You can see where his center of gravity is. He's going to fall to the right. So my rule of thumb is to keep both your belt buckle and your chest between the rails of the ladder at all times, because your chest, again, is your center of gravity. The moment your center of gravity exits the rail of that ladder, you're now off balance and you're just waiting to either tip the ladder or fall off of it, one of the two. So if this guy wants to wash the right side of this window, he needs to scoot that ladder over more in front of the window. What he's doing right now is no bueno. Okay, a couple more things on ladders that I don't have pictures up here. If you're using an A-frame style step ladder, so the ones that open up, you are not allowed to fold those and lean them against something. I know that there are ones now that are made to do that. Again, if your label and manual does not say that you can keep it folded and lean it against something, don't. That's an OSHA citation waiting to happen, and it's an injury waiting to happen. This year's they have not announced what the fines are going to be yet this year officially from OSHA, but last year they were around $12,900. This year, they're expected to cross the $13,000 mark for the standard OSHA violation. And that's for anything from not filling out the tags on your fire extinguisher all the way up to IDLH violations. You're looking at $13,000 for a standard violation and well over $140,000 for a willful violation. Again, those numbers haven't been announced yet this year, but they should be coming out soon. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else on the ladder I want to share with you. Oh, fall protection on the ladder. I'll actually be talking about that in the next slide, I think. So work platforms are safer than ladders. Work platforms are much safer than ladders because you can guardrail them and they're less likely to tip over. They have 4 structural supports instead of just 2. Users need to be trained how to properly use a ladder anytime that they do need to. Again, substitute that hazard out if you can with a work platform like a scissor lift, if possible. But if you can't use a scissor lift and you have to use a ladder, make sure that the users are trained on how to properly use that ladder. I sent out an email this morning to everyone who registered. I think 1 or 2 of the emails kicked back to me because it did not have a proper email address. If you didn't get that email from me this morning, shoot me an email and I'll send you those handouts. But I did send you a ladder safety handout that's great to go over with your employees. Okay, make sure that they're using 3 points of contact while ascending and descending. Like I said before, keep their center of gravity and belt buckle between the rails, and do not hop or scoot the ladders left or right. You need to get the whole way down off the ladder before you move it anywhere else. Okay. Anytime you're using an extension ladder, make sure that you're securing that ladder. There's a couple different ways you can do that. Obviously, the first person to go up is not going to have the ladder secured because they're the one that has to go to the top and tie it off to something. So when that first person goes up, they need to make sure that someone else is holding that ladder for them while they go up. If you have a soft surface you're putting this ladder on, like you're using it outside and it's rained recently, so the ground is soft, put a piece of lumber, a flat piece of lumber, underneath the ladder that is wide enough so that the ladder's not going to slide off of it, and that'll help create a larger surface area for it to press down with, so that one rail does not sink down further than the other. And then you can also drive a post into the ground in front of that ladder, which you can tie the two bottom rails off to, in order to make sure it's not going to scoot out. Okay. If you want more information on securing ladders, you can email me, or you can just Google it. There's plenty of videos out there to show you good ways to secure your ladders. If you're looking for more ladder rules, those can be found in 29 CFR 1910-23 for those of you that are in general industry. I don't know if we have many construction employers in here, but if you guys are looking for more, it's in subpart X of 1926. Okay. One new rule, or a slight change to an older rule, I guess, is that fixed ladders, so your permanent ladders that are built onto your buildings, if they are greater than 24 feet, they're now required to have fall protection. If you have a cage on the ladder, that is only acceptable until 2036. After November 18th, 2036, you have to have a better system for fall protection on your ladder. They gave a large grace period because those systems are expensive. Really, your two best options are either a SRL, which is a self-retracting lifeline mounted at the top of your ladder, typically better if it's indoors, or if you're outdoors, the better option is a fixed ladder system, which is a lifeline that's actually attached to your ladder, and then your worker would wear a harness with a chest D-ring that would attach to that lifeline as they go up and down the ladder. And if they fall, it actually bites off onto that cable and keeps them from falling any more than 2 feet. More information on that new fixed ladder rule can be found at 29 CFR 1910-28, section B9. And if you just type 1910-28B9 into your web browser, the first result that'll pop up will have that standard in it on OSHA's website. So OSHA has made their standards fairly easy to find as long as you know the standard number. So. Okay, a little bit more on stairways. I've been beating these stairways up today. So make sure that stairway treads and walkways are free of any dangerous objects, debris, and material. You should never have anything sitting on your stairs or at the landing of your staircase. You want to keep all of that out of the way. You don't want to create any additional hazards there. It's already a dangerous area just because it's a stairway. Any slippery conditions on stairways and walkways need to be corrected immediately. I'm especially pointing towards your outdoor stairways and walkways and sidewalks, making sure that you have those salted in the winter. I moved far away from the snow last year, actually, so I luckily don't have to worry about that too much anymore. But those of you that are experiencing winter weather, make sure you're getting that salt and gravel down early, and making sure that you don't have any slip hazards on your walkways and stairways. You do need to have a tread covering your entire step landing. You cannot have a kind of slippy surface on your step. I don't think anyone should have too much to worry about there. That should have been handled when your stairs were built. Okay. Anytime, and this is the one I see a lot of violations with. Again, this is a rule directly from OSHA. Any stairway that has 4 or more risers must have railings on the open sides of all exposed stairways and stair platforms, and handrails on at least one side of a closed stairway, preferably the right side while descending. The rails are actually more important for the folks going down than going up. Again, unless you're like me when I was a child, where I like to sprint upstairs and I'd always miss one. So make sure you have handrails on at least one side if it's a closed stairway, and rails on both sides if it's an open and exposed stairway. Okay, if you need any more information on stairway rules from OSHA, those of you in general industry, that is going to be in 29 CFR 1910.25. Okay, they do a really good job of kind of step-by-step explaining everything about stairways in that standard. Okay, now getting into the kind of the bigger jobs. I know this isn't going to apply to everyone in this webinar, but I know that some of you it does. Fall protection when you're working at heights, so you're up on a scaffold, you're up on a platform, things like that. Every year, falls consistently make the top 3 causes for workplace fatalities. Again, most of those fatalities are people who are working at heights. There are a number of factors involved in the falls, including an unstable work surface, misuse or failure to use fall protection equipment, and human error. I will tell you, hands down, the leading common thing between all these fatalities is either a failure to use fall protection, or they had the equipment, they wore the equipment, but they didn't wear it correctly. They put it on wrong. They made permanent alterations to their harness that damaged it, such as cutting off extra webbing or poking an extra hole through for their belt loop. Or they simply did not connect to anything or did not connect to an anchorage that was of the appropriate strength. Okay. I have taught fall protection inspection classes and fall protection classes where the whole reason they called to have the class taught is because they had a fatality recently at that place of business. I'm actually going to be heading up to Illinois about 2 weeks from now. I'll be teaching a class at a location who called and requested a class because they had a fatality last year. So this is a very serious issue. On average, every day, 2 people die at work due to a fall from heights. That's every day, and that's only in the United States. We see anywhere from 700 to 900 deaths per year that are related to falls from heights just in the United States. So that number does vary pretty widely every year. That mostly depends on the economy and how much construction work is going on. So we saw it dip down. We saw our lowest numbers in the 600s back during the recession. And ever since then, they've been climbing back up as far as fatalities go. So employers are not doing much of a better job of protecting their workers. Most employers are, but when you look at employers as a whole, it tends to be the smaller companies that are not doing things correctly. The larger companies, your commercial construction companies, they tend to enforce the fall protection rules much better than smaller companies, simply because smaller companies tend to not have a safety professional on staff, so they don't really even know that they're doing things incorrectly because they don't have anyone really teaching them the proper way to do it or what the rules are. So that's something to keep in mind there. Okay. There are lots of different versions of fall protection. It's not just wearing a harness and tying off. It's also guardrails. It's also safety nets. It's also restraint systems. Those are all things that can prevent people from injuries and falling. Also, hole covers. A lot of people have access hatches onto their roof where they climb up a ladder, open a hatch, and they can get onto their roof. What a lot of people don't have is guardrails around those hatches, so that when someone's working on the roof and that hatch is open, that they're not backing up or not looking in a certain direction and fall into that hatch or hole. So if you don't have a hatch that stays closed or automatically closes, you need to make sure you put guardrails around that hatch so that people can't fall into it. That's considered an open hole, excuse me, at that point. Consider using aerial lifts or elevated platforms to provide a safer elevated working surface. I talked about that earlier. Aerial lifts and scissor lifts are going to be much safer than a ladder, but again, you need to make sure your employees are properly trained to use it and they're wearing the proper PPE while they are using it, which we will talk about in a little bit. Erect guardrail systems with toe boards and warning lines or restraint line systems to protect workers near edges. So one of the common misconceptions, I actually just had a phone call yesterday from somebody else in the consulting industry that wanted to make sure they were right about something. They had a client call them insisting that it was okay that they work on their roof as long as they stay at least 20 feet away from the edge. There is no such exemption from OSHA for something like that. OSHA, their exact words are, there is no safe distance from an edge, meaning even if you have a 12-acre facility, if you get up on that roof in the very center, OSHA says you need to be tied off or you need to have fall protection, warning lines, or guardrails on that roof protecting you from the edge. Uh, Typically, the simplest system is and the cheapest system is going to be warning lines if you don't have to do a lot of work on your roof. A warning line is just essentially a rope with flags on it. You can find more information on this in the fall protection standard from OSHA. But it's just a rope with flags on it every so many feet that is about 39 inches off the work surface, so that if a worker's not facing it, if he's backing up, it's going to hit him in his back. It's not a guardrail. It's not going to keep you from falling. It's not going to force you to stay inside. It's just a line that's there to let you know this line is 15 feet or 6 feet, depending on your industry, from the edge. And you're not allowed to go past it unless you tie off or get guardrails put up. So that's kind of the simplest system. Beyond that, you can erect temporary or permanent guardrail systems. Restraint lines would be where you tie off and it keeps your chest from even getting to the edge. It keeps your center of gravity from going over the edge. So if you don't have to work in a corner, restraint systems are great. But if you have to work in a corner, you can't use restraint, because if you have a line that's long enough for you to get to the very corner, if you move left or right, you can fall over those edges of the roof. Make sure that you're covering floor holes. I already mentioned that. Skylights are extremely dangerous. Skylights cannot support someone's body weight. They do make safety systems for skylights. They make nets for underneath them. They make mesh cages that go over top of them that'll still allow light through, but will keep people from falling through them. A great place if you want to kind of see that type of safety system is most Walmarts now that have skylights have now upgraded their skylights to have a cage over the top. So if you haven't ever seen one of those, a lot of times you'll be able to find them at large department stores like that. The other option is to put guardrails around your skylights. Skylights are especially dangerous in the winter, because when are we most likely in the Northeast to get leaks in our roof? After it snows. The weight of that snow can mess up our shingles a little bit. A leak starts as the snow melts. Someone's got to go up there and fix it. If you have skylights, you cannot see where that skylight is if it's covered in snow. And if someone steps on that skylight, it's a lot of times those end up being fatalities. There was one in Virginia up on top of a gymnasium, 90-foot fall to the gym floor. So those are one of the most common fatality types, is stepping on non-load supporting areas of a roof. All right, and then ultimately you can use personal fall arrest systems or body harnesses. Those are kind of the last line of safety for falls, and that is because with a personal fall arrest system, you still fall and now you need rescued. Okay. And you can still have injuries when you fall, even if you do everything correctly, if there's some swing fall or anything like that. So the better way is to protect someone with a guardrail. And then kind of your last resort is, okay, we're going to use personal fall arrest systems. Anytime you have a personal fall arrest system, you need to have a rescue plan to get that person down. Okay. With the guardrails, I talked about those a lot already. There are rules for guardrails. You can't just put some makeshift guardrail up. With guardrails, they're required for unprotected sides or edges 4 feet or more above a lower level in general industry. They're not absolutely hardline required anymore if you're using an alternative form of fall protection, though. Okay, guardrail systems should have a top and intermediate or mid rail. The top rail should be 42 inches in height, and they now give you plus or minus 3-inch variation. The purpose of that plus or minus 3 inches is if you want to use wire rope or cable as a guardrail, because there's going to be some deflection in the center of those. So the lowest point has to be 42 plus or minus 3 inches. Okay. And those need to be capable of withstanding a force of 200 pounds applied within 2 inches of the top edge in any outward or downward direction. The reason they don't have that requirement in the upward direction is because gravity doesn't allow us to fall upwards. And if we want to, let's say we have an area that we're using for access, so we need a forklift to lift pallets up onto a mezzanine or something like that, we want to be able to remove those rails in order for them to be able to lift things up there and drop it off with a forklift. Keep in mind, anytime that you're removing a guardrail temporarily, anybody in that area that is exposed to that fall hazard with the guardrail removed needs to either be gone before you take the guardrail off, or they have to be tied off. Okay, we're going to talk about aerial lifts here. Then I'm going to take a short break, which will be right around 2 o'clock, and then we will get into the overexertion portion. Okay, so with aerial lifts, I'm going to be talking about vehicle mounted booms, extensible boom platforms, and articulating boom platforms. I actually just had a video yesterday come across my feed, and some of you may have seen it because it was on the news a lot of places, where fall protection system actually saved a guy's life in one of those vehicle mounted boom trucks. He did not necessarily fall from it, but he was working on a traffic light. And they didn't do a very good job of putting in administrative controls like flagging traffic and things like that. And a box truck came through the intersection, and the top of the box truck actually clipped his basket, which flung him out of it. But luckily, the guy was wearing his fall protection, was tied off to the boom arm, and was pretty much uninjured. Got really lucky in that situation, and also was very well prepared. So talking about aerial lifts, is fall protection required in an aerial lift? Okay, the answer to that is yes. The correct place to attach, and again, I'm talking about lifts that have boom arms. The correct place to attach is going to be at the manufacturer's designated attachment point. You cannot connect outside the basket, and you cannot connect to basket guardrails. Those rules come from the manufacturers. Those manufacturers typically do not allow you to attach to the guardrails or outside the basket. And my pictures weren't showing up. There we go. So the picture up top there shows you that designated manufacturer's attachment point. Typically, they're near the floor, and sometimes they're around the mid-rail level as well. There is a hierarchy to what is best to connect to these with. A PFL is your best option. PFL stands for Personal Fall Limiter. They are small versions of self-retracting lifelines. They work very similar to a seatbelt, where if you start to fall, they lock off. The reason those are so advantageous is with these boom lifts that have a long boom arm, if you hit a bump, it will catapult you out of the boom lift. Um, if you've never seen that before, just type in boom lift catapult on YouTube at some point, and there are a couple good videos out there of it. It's an extremely dangerous situation, but those videos are actually very good training tools if you have workers that use these in order to show them exactly why they need to tie off. Your second best option is a restraint lanyard. That should be short enough to keep you from getting over the guardrails. The reason that's not as advantageous is because the restraint lanyard will actually hinder you from doing your work in all areas of the basket. So if you tie off on one end, you make it short enough to not get over the guardrails, you can't get to the other end of the basket. The energy absorbing lanyard, the reason that is your worst connector option is because if you start to get launched up, that energy absorbing lanyard, it's a 6-foot long lanyard, is so you're going to fly 6 feet into the air, and you're going to have so much force when you're going up that you're going to start to rip that energy absorber in your lanyard. So you're going to start to use up the energy absorber as you're going upwards. Then you're going to come down. In most cases, you're going to come down outside the guardrails. You're going to keep falling. You're going to free fall for a while, and then your lanyard's going to get tight again, and it's going to start to rip out the rest of that energy absorbing device inside the lanyard, which will extend it up to 18 feet, which means there's a very good chance you could still hit the ground. Also, if it only partially deploys and you come down outside the basket, you'll start to swing back into the basket. And there have been cases where someone's head has hit the bottom of the basket, and that has ended in an internal decapitation, which ultimately results in a fatality. So those are kind of your worst option. So really, the PFLs are the best way to go, those personal fall limiters. And those are now extremely affordable compared to what they used to be. They're now in the $100 to $250 range, depending on what you get. General prohibitions with those lifts. You're not allowed to move large distances with the basket elevated. That's how you tip these over. You end up getting their center of gravity off, and it's also how you end up launching yourself out of it. Also, standing on the basket guardrails is not permitted, which we see down in that picture on the bottom right. That is extremely common. The moment you stand on the guardrails, your center of gravity is above the guardrails and you're leaning forward, you're going right out of that basket if you lose your balance. Aerial lift mistakes. I was just talking about this. So typical lanyards require 18 feet plus of fall clearance, which only happens when the lift is elevated really high. So those don't work well when workers are using lifts. Your best option is either a Class A or a Class B PFL, which I have an image of one here on the right. With those PFLs, instead of having 18 feet of total fall distance, if you have a Class A, you have 4 feet of total fall distance. You're going to have 24 inches for your deceleration, so the energy absorber in it. You're going to have a 24-inch safety factor, which is just what the manufacturer requires you to add on just in case you make any errors in your calculation or not sure how high you are. They make you add a 2-foot safety factor. And then if you get a Class B PFL, which is actually the one I have pictured here to the right, they have a 54-inch deceleration distance. And then you add on top of that the other 24-inch safety factor, which will bring you to a total of, I got to do quick math in my head, I believe that's 4.5 feet plus 2 feet. So you're going to have 6.5 feet of fall distance with that. Both of those are significantly less than the 18 feet of fall distance you get with a traditional lanyard. Okay. I haven't talked about scissor lifts yet. So this one, if any of you have scissor lifts in your facility, so I want you to answer this question in the chat box. Is fall protection required in a scissor lift? So I know there's a little bit of a delay between when I talk and when you guys hear it. So I'm going to give you guys a minute or two to go ahead and type in that chat box to the right whether or not you think fall protection is required in a scissor lift. We're quiet this time. So I did a similar webinar in Washington. They were a little more talkative. So looks like nobody wants to venture a guess at this one. The answer is yes. Fall protection is required. Ah, good. Good. There, now you're all popping in. I must have just not waited long enough for the delay. Fall protection is required, but that is a trick question. So bear with me. So Laura, you said we don't use them, but you would guess yes. So that's a trick question. If you think back about 5 or 6 slides ago, I mentioned that there is more than one type of fall protection. So you don't have to have a harness and a lanyard for it to be considered fall protection. In an aerial lift, the ones we were talking about on the last slide, you have to tie off in those. That is, period, you have to have fall arrest in those. With scissor lifts, you only need fall protection. You do not need fall arrest. So the guardrails suffice in a scissor lift. And that is actually because of a loophole. Scissor lifts are considered scaffolding. They're considered mobile scaffolding. Scaffolding has its own set of rules. And with scaffolding, you're told you only need guardrails. So the guardrails is all you need is in a scissor lift. You don't have to tie off. That being said, I'm going to tell you, most companies now at this point require connection anyway. So if you're in a scissor lift, I'm going to tell you, I think you should tie off with fall arrest with a PFL. Is it mandatory by OSHA? No, it is not. According to OSHA, the only thing you need is the guardrails. The reason I want you to tie off and I'm encouraging you to have your workers tie off is because most of the injuries and fatalities involving a scissor lift are because of human error where someone violates a rule. An employee stands on the guardrail. An employee leans through the middle of the guardrails and falls out. Very few tip overs with these. Donald had a great comment. He's been on job sites where it doesn't matter. Anytime you're above 6 feet requires a tie off. So the construction rule for safety at heights is 6 feet. For general industry, it's 4 feet. But most construction sites, just like Donald just said, most construction sites require connection no matter what. Doesn't matter if you're in a scissor lift, a boom lift, period. They want you to have it. And that is a great practice to have. So again, I recommend that you tie off to scissor lifts. If your scissor lift does not have a designated manufacturer's attachment point, older ones do not, but Genie and JLG, the major manufacturers of scissor lifts, have released retrofit kits for all of their scissor lifts in order to allow you to bolt on anchorage points that are sufficient for holding a person in the event of a fall, and I recommend that you do that. So great commentary there. All right. Personal fall arrest systems, we're getting to the end of these here. Make sure you inspect them before use for any damage or degradation. So if you have a harness and a lanyard, make sure you're following the manufacturer's requirements for inspecting those. Okay. Defective components need to be removed from service, and anchorages must be capable of supporting at least 5,000 pounds per worker attached. Okay. So that's where we get into some eyeballing things. So if you're tying off, you need to have an anchorage point that supports at least 5,000 pounds. How do we know something holds 5,000 pounds? We don't have an engineer on staff. We don't. That's okay. OSHA has clarified this through their OSHA 30-hour training course. They say that if you can look at an anchorage point and you think that it can hold the static weight, in other words, if you would put a lifting chain on there, that it could hold the static weight of a 1970s model Chevy truck. If that sounds oddly specific, that's because it is. So the rules came out in the 70s, and back then in the 70s, trucks weighed approximately 5,000 pounds. So that has been the rules they have used for a long time. With that being said, your worker is never going to put 5,000 pounds of force on their anchorage point. All the fall protection equipment that is designed for use for fall protection is designed to inflict a peak force of 1,800 pounds, but an average resting force of 900 pounds. That means your worker should never really even have the possibility of putting more than 1,800 pounds of force into an anchorage point. The reason OSHA requires 5,000 is because they know we're eyeballing this, and they want to be sure that whatever we're eyeballing, we have a lot of room for error. So that's why you're allowed to eyeball that 5,000 pounds. Okay. And then lastly here, one thing that I skipped out on that I mentioned a little bit before, but I wanted to bring back up again, especially because it's March right now. I know that in certain parts of Ohio, Pennsylvania, we are still seeing some slippery conditions. One day it might be 60 degrees, the next day it's 20 degrees. So keep in mind that there is going to be ice outside your workplaces. And to make sure that you're handling that as well, because that's where we see a lot of the smaller injuries come in is due to slips on ice. And that's also where you could have customers get injured as well. And a lawsuit with a customer is worse than a workers' comp case with an employee. So make sure you're keeping those, at least doing your due diligence to keep the ice down. And don't forget the outdoors. Don't forget your parking lots. Make sure you're filling and patching any cracks and holes. Make sure you're repairing and eliminating any raised areas because of tree roots or settling, cold weather, and ordinary wear and tear that's putting trip hazards into your parking lots and your outdoor areas. Make sure you're reducing surface water by directing your roof drainage away from sidewalks and parking areas. A lot of times I'll see gutters get broken and people just do a quick fix, and now all of a sudden all their water's pouring right onto their sidewalk, and it's snow melt, and at 10 o'clock that night it's all going to freeze back over and be a nice big frozen spot in the morning. So make sure you're keeping your water moving away from your work or your walk areas. Okay. Already talked about clearing your snow and ice. Make sure you center and secure your parking stoppers, and paint or stain those parking stoppers safety yellow to improve visibility so that people aren't tripping over those, and also so they see them and don't drive their cars over them. Sometimes those can blend in with the parking lot very easily. I might know someone who did that a couple days ago. Might have been me. So make sure those are painted yellow so people see them. All right. And then some more best practices with shoes and boots. Make sure you're monitoring the tread depth of your shoes with wear. Make sure you're choosing the right shoe for the right environment. Think beyond slip resistance. So if you're working in construction, you should be having steel toes on if you have a chance of your toes getting crushed and things like that. What costs more? So a lot of you I know probably have to convince some boss somewhere to spend money on these things. Shoes and boots, you're allowed to make your employees pay for those. But if you make your employees pay for those, they're not going to be getting the best thing possible. Give me 1 second. My microphone's beeping at me. The battery's dying. All right, I got it plugged in now. So what costs more? You need to convince the boss to spend some money. Um, it's very simple to show him one lost time case due to a slip or a trip costs the company thousands and thousands of dollars. To buy a pair of shoes for the whole company probably only costs an upfront cost of, depending on how many employees you have, a couple hundred to a couple $1,000s. One thing we did on the pipeline was, people are kind of picky about their shoes. So when I worked on the pipeline, we had a new boot policy where if you were a new employee, you would go out, you'd buy a pair of boots, whatever pair of boots you wanted, you'd bring us your receipt, and we would reimburse you up to $100 for those boots. So we were essentially subsidizing the cost to encourage them to get good boots to replace their old ones. And then if I would come across anyone who had been working there for a while and had, holes in their boots or they were getting all torn up because they worked hard, I would say, hey, listen, your boots are destroyed. I'm willing to write in for you to get another boot allowance to replace them because this is normal wear and tear, and you need new ones because it's a safety hazard. So we'll help you take care of it, and that usually works well. So like in a restaurant industry or something like that, even just a $20, people might go out and buy a $50 pair of shoes. They don't want to buy it if they have to pay for the whole thing, but if you're going to pay for like half of it, they're more likely to go out and get better shoes and reduce these incidents. Okay. So what costs more, a new pair of boots or 31-day lost time accidents or 33-day lost time accidents? The money adds up quick when you're letting things happen. And then also think about what protects and values your employees more. Spending that money on your employees protects and values them more. And valued employees are much more careful. They're much more likely to stay with your company because they know you care about them. They know you're investing in them. And those are the employees you want to keep around. Okay. So is it enough? These are some examples of boots that I would say should probably get replaced either now or fairly soon, especially this photo on the left. That is a huge slip hazard. You can tell that he's putting a lot of pressure in moving one side of his shoe more than the other. He needs to replace those. Okay. So you require, and I get this all the time. I'll go into a facility, I'll be doing an audit, and I'll notice that a lot of their footwear is terrible. And I'll say, what do you do for footwear? And they say, we require employees to purchase the appropriate footwear. And then, okay, great, but do you check to make sure it meets your standards after they purchase it? And also, are you checking to make sure they haven't deteriorated? That is important. You got to follow up with this stuff. You can't just require it up front and expect people to replace them on their own if no one is keeping track of it and telling them, hey, that's not going to fly anymore. Okay. Is it enough putting up a wet floor sign? So, something spilled. Well, we put the sign up. Okay, great. But did anybody clean it up? The sign is an administrative control that's only effective if it is read and respected. Signs are often overlooked or ignored. It's a good start, but after the hazard's identified, it needs to be controlled. Okay, dry the area, remove the hazard at its source, and then remove that sign when you're done, because that sign is also a trip hazard for people who aren't paying attention, which nowadays is a lot of people, especially our customers, and quite possibly some of our employees at times. Okay. All right. Is it enough? So we had this cord that was running across the floor. It's a trip hazard, and now we've placed this. I don't even know what you would call that. This cord cover over top of it to reduce the trip hazard. So we've done a good job of reducing this trip hazard. We've made the surface more flat, more regular, less likely to trip over, but still that's a slight trip hazard. Do we have other options? The other option is to have, if you have an in-house maintenance guy who does electrical work and is qualified to do so, maybe we run, if this is something that we need all the time, that cord's always going to be there. Maybe we run a permanent electrical line under the floor, under the floor's surface. One thing you cannot do, and I see this happen all the time, is people will have this cord running and they'll just take a rug and put a rug over top of it. That is not permitted. That is still a trip hazard in the eyes of OSHA. So make sure you're either covering it with something appropriate like a cord cover that we see here on the bottom, or you're running permanent electrical if it's something that you're going to need all the time. The other thing you could do is rearrange the room. Maybe this is running to a desk. What if we move that desk up against that wall where the cord is going and have the walkway on the other side of the desk so there's no trip hazard? So there's more than one way to solve a lot of these problems. So in summary for the slip, trips, and falls, falls occur in all industry sectors, they result in serious injuries or death, and they're very costly for businesses. The standards for walking working surfaces include requirements for housekeeping, guarding floor and wall openings and holes, and industrial stairs and ladders. And we want to keep walking working surfaces clean, dry, uncluttered, and doing so will prevent most of our workplace accidents from occurring. And the other thing I don't have here is making employees aware. Your employees need to know that these are the things we have to do, and they need to know that safety is their responsibility. It's everybody's responsibility. Just because you're the administrative assistant doesn't mean that it's not your job to make sure that when there's a cord running across the floor that you don't let a supervisor know or move it. So make sure that you're educating your employees as well. Unsafe surfaces need to be reported and corrected as soon as they're found by anybody. Okay. From there, that's it for the slips, trips, and falls. Now we're going to get into a section on overexertions. So we're at 2:15 now Eastern time. So we've got about 45 minutes left. I'm just gonna take a real quick moment here. Let's say about 2 or 3 minutes. If anyone has any questions, go ahead and type those in the live chat about the slip, trip, fall section. I'll answer those now. And also, that way, anyone that needs a chance to use the restroom or anything like that, you guys can take a moment to do that as well. So we'll go ahead here. I'll give you about 2 minutes. Type in any questions if anyone has any. If not, we'll get moving here at 2:15. All right. I had a couple questions come in by email for folks who didn't have an account set up on here to participate in the chat. So I answered a couple of those. We sometimes have done last. We sometimes have strip old wax off of floors, but when you're doing that, the floors become extremely slippery. What's the best way to approach that? Um, that's a good question. If anyone has that situation and has handled it, feel free to chime in with a comment. I would say probably non-slip shoes. Also, when you're stripping the old wax off the floors, I'm not familiar with that process personally, but if there's a way to keep the stripping device in front of you and for you to stay on the smooth surface while you're doing that, or sorry, the unaffected surface while you're doing that, and kind of just work your way backwards. That would be my recommendation. Um, but other than that, unless I saw the process, I'm not sure I'd be able to answer it very well for you. All right, gonna go ahead and get into these overexertions then. So an overexertion, these also, I didn't mention these in the previous section, but they're also one of the leading causes of lost time incidents. They're also some of the most expensive incidents. With overexertion injuries, you're typically looking at a back injury, and these folks are typically out of work for a while. There's usually physical therapy involved, sometimes chiropractic, and you can have a claim just snowball up to a couple hundred grand very quickly with these types of injuries, depending on how bad they are. So, an overexertion is when a person works beyond his or her physical capacity or the tolerances of his or her body's soft tissues or their muscles and in tendons. Factors related to overexertion are going to include their age, their physical condition, their body flexibility, obesity, strength, and all of those factors are going to relate to how much a person can handle, and it's going to be different for every person. That's what makes overexertions extremely complicated. Is one employee could do the task without getting injured, and another employee is going to get injured trying to do a task if it's too strenuous. Which is why a lot of times we talk about lifting in this case. That's why those types of things should be done as a team if it's something quite heavy. You should not have your largest, most muscular person try to lift the heaviest object. Instead, have two or three people team lift it. And we'll talk about that as we go on. According to the 2016 workplace statistics, overexertion injuries cost businesses nationwide about $15.08 billion. So that's a lot of money that we have into overexertion injuries, and a lot of that is paid to medical and lost time. Very much of it goes to lost time, though. Nearly a quarter of the overall national injury burden, and again, that's from 2016's Liberty Mutual Workplace Safety Index. And the data that was used for that is from their numbers in 2013. They put one of these out about every 3 years. Okay. 1.1 million people per year are affected by manual handling injuries, and that results in 9.3 million lost time days per year. So that means workers' comp is paying out salaries for people up to 9.3 million lost time days. Excuse me. Your typical overexertion injury, the body parts that are going to be affected, we see shoulders. Back injuries are by and far the most common. Tendon and joint injuries, leg, knee, and ankle injuries, neck injuries. And those types of injuries that we see are sprains, strains, hernias, muscle tears, and things along those lines, which most of those don't sound very serious, but when you're especially talking about your back muscles, you have a lot of chronic pain that ends up getting associated with those types of things. And those chronic type pain injuries, uh, and those others, those sprains and strains and muscle tears, some of those result in very permanent effects, especially on older individuals. Someone could throw their back out one time or have some sort of strain in their back, and it's going to affect them for the rest of their life. They're going to be unable to pick things up as easily. They're going to be unable to walk as easily, and they're going to have a lower quality of life because of that. And there's a good chance they could end up with chronic pain as well. And those types of injuries result in very large costs for employers through workers' comp. The common causes, pulling, pushing, or carrying heavy items, usually things that are more than 50 pounds. Typically, things under 50 pounds are reasonable for a person to pick up on their own. Now, you obviously don't want your smallest non muscular person lifting a 50-pound object. So try to be sensible about things. But for the average person, 50 pounds or less is fairly reasonable. What I see trending, especially in areas that I work in a lot with employers directly, is I see a lot of these injuries on older workers. And the more I get to talking to the employers about the worker, I'm like, well, why would he be lifting something like that? He's 60 years old. And they say, we didn't know he was doing it. He didn't ask for help because he's been doing this for 20 years or 30 years or 40 years, and he doesn't want to ask anybody for help. So keep an eye out for your kind of stubborn aging workforce that doesn't like to ask for help, and encourage them and let them know it's okay to ask for help. We don't want you to get hurt. We know you're here for a paycheck. We want you to be able to stay here and keep getting a paycheck. We love the work you do for us. If you need help lifting something, let somebody know. There's no shame in that. Okay. Lifting heavy items or improperly lifting items. Improperly lifting items is a big one. So lifting with their back instead of their legs, and also I don't know if I have it on here as a bullet point, but reaching. If you have something that's far back on a shelf and you have to reach in and grab it, don't try to lift it up when you reach back to grab it. First thing you need to do is pull it to the edge of the shelf before you try to lift it up. Because when you get your body stretched out into a shelf and try to lift something up, that's when you start to really hurt those muscles in your body. You don't have them lined up the way they're supposed to be lined up to do a lift. Any repeated or long-term bending or twisting at the waist, you don't want employees to do that. So if you have a repetitive motion type job that is requiring employees to bend or twist at their waist or their trunk, you need to find a way to alter that process so that they don't have to keep twisting. That is going to result in a very serious workers' comp claim down the line. Whether it's years down the line or months down the line, we don't know. But I'm telling you, if someone is doing that repeatedly over a period of time, they are going to end up with a very large workers' comp claim due to a back injury. Reaching, I did have it on here as a bullet point. We already talked about that. Throwing things, there should really be no reason to throw things in the workplace. If there is a reason to throw things in the workplace, we need to find a way to change that process. Okay, unless you're playing football is a career, you shouldn't be throwing too many things. Long-term poor posture, such as sitting or standing. So this is one I get a lot of phone calls about from clients as far as ergonomics go. There are some very great online self-evaluation tools for office workers to use. If you ever need one of those, shoot me an email. I can get it to you. Where they can evaluate essentially their workstation for their computer to see, oh, maybe that's why I have a bad back, is because it's not that they don't have the right equipment. It's not that there's anything wrong with their desk or their chair. Typically, it's because they're not properly using their chair and they're sitting with very poor posture. Okay, long time absorbing vibration from machine or transport. I see these types of injuries. These usually aren't too bad as far as cost wise, but I see these for like dozer operators and things like that. As technology has progressed, we've gotten air ride seats in the cabins. So those really take out the vibration issues when you have those seats that essentially have their own suspension. And then combinations of those above actions as well. Oops, I don't know why these are blinking twice on me. There we go. High risk industries. So these are the industries where we see the most risk for back injuries. Construction is consistently among the most dangerous industries for many things, including falls. But here we're particularly talking about overexertion. Construction workers typically work long hours and they need to move heavy materials no matter what the conditions. And a lot of times, construction sites, people are busy and they can't find somebody to help them. And there's not a clear chain of command or a clear cut, this is your job and this is my job type thing on a construction site, because you're doing something different every day. Your job task changes every day. In general industry, it's much easier to control because you're typically doing the same things every day at work when you're in general industry. Healthcare workers. I do a lot of consulting with healthcare clients. Many healthcare workers, like nurses, EMTs, and home health aides, spend their days lifting and moving people or objects around. Those repetitive movements combined with their long shifts means overexertion industries are prevalent in this field. You notice here in both of these cases, I talked about long shifts. The longer someone's shift is, the more likely they are to have an overexertion industry injury. A lot of times because they're tired, because they're fatigued, and sometimes, often, especially in the healthcare industry, overworked. And also with healthcare workers, they're not just lifting objects; they are lifting people. People move around. They're more of a fluid than a solid. So our arms move, our legs move. And a lot of times, some of these patients might be fighting them or resisting, or just simply unable to help lift themselves. And this could cause those workers to simply throw their back out because the object they're lifting isn't really centered. It moves. Um, and also, we can add into this. We talked about slips, trips, and falls already. A lot of times, the causes of falls for healthcare workers is they're trying to lift somebody, they're overexerting themselves, they lose their balance, and then they end up with a combination of both overexertion injuries and fall injuries because as they're overexerting themselves and getting off balance, they also fall, and they fall on top of the patient or the patient falls on top of them. So healthcare workers especially need to be extra careful with moving patients, and there are a lot of aids for moving patients, lifting aids to help lift patients and move them safely. Warehouse and retail. Overexertion is very common in warehouse and retail. Retail is primarily failure to train. A lot of times, the retail industry does not do a lot of training, especially for lifting and things like that. Because they have such high turnover, they invest a lot less in training, but that reflects on their workers' comp issues. Okay. Those workers are again typically spending long hours in repetitive tasks, including moving objects on and off shelves or scanning inventory. Any worker that's lifting, carrying, or pushing objects can face an overexertion industry injury. I'm going to talk a little bit later about carts, which a lot to the retail industry as well as the hospitality industry. Anytime you have to push or pull an object, the safer thing to do is typically push it. You're a lot more likely to have an overexertion injury while pulling because you put your body in awkward positions to pull. And then transportation. It may seem counterintuitive, but truck drivers who sit for long hours and move heavy objects are also prime targets for overexertion. Proper stretching and safety equipment can reduce the risk of serious injuries. I also want to swing that back around to construction as well. Construction workers, you've probably heard of the stretch and flex programs. Stretching prior to working can reduce overexertion injuries very well. That is why people stretch before they participate in sports. You're going to be less likely then to pull a muscle. The same thing goes for when you're lifting things. If you stretch before you're lifting, you're going to reduce the chance of injury. So, how do we get into actually preventing these things? For one, avoid the need for any hazardous material handling. So, if you can replace things, if you can get conveyor belts rather than having people carry things, if you can get pallet jacks rather than people lifting things one by one off a pallet, just jack up the pallet and use that mechanical aid, that's better. So, if you can avoid the need to handle things, it's better. Assess the risk of injury from any hazardous material handling or hazardous manual handling. So if you have to lift objects up, what are you lifting up? What shape is it? Is it fairly evenly distributed, or are you lifting up an oddly shaped device? Anytime something has an odd shape, you should lift it as a group because the center of gravity is going to be hard to find. How far do I have to bend over to pick this up, or how far do I have to squat to pick this up should be the real question. Because you should not be bending over to pick things up like we see this fella in this picture here. You should be squatting down so that you're lifting with your legs. How heavy is the object? If it's above 50 pounds, someone should not be lifting it on their own. We're going to want to reduce the risk of injury from that hazardous manual handling. How do we do that? we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but we're going to bring in team lifting. We're going to make sure we're lifting it properly, that we're centering the load in front of us, that we're squatting down, not bending over, and that we're lifting with our legs, not our back. Okay, so 3 questions to really ask yourself before you lift something. Does that large workpiece really need to be moved, or can the activity be done safely where it is? So if I work in a metal fabrication shop, if I'm, for example, I was up in Washington recently with a client who manufactures boats. That client has some very large pieces of metal that need to be worked on. They have some really good controls in place and things to move it automatically for them, so no one's actually lifting it. But let's say they didn't have those things. Once they made the hull of the boat, if they don't need to move it to add the other pieces, can't we just bring those other smaller pieces over to it? If so, then let's do that. Let's reduce the need to actually move the heavy object. For those of you in healthcare, can you take the treatment to the patient? Do you have to move the patient, or can the patient be treated where they are? Can raw materials be piped or conveyed to their point of use instead of having to have someone go pick up boxes of whatever supplies you need? Is there a way to funnel them to that point or convey them to that point? If you ask those 3 questions and you're unable to do those options, if you still have to manually handle the objects, the employee should inform the employer of the hazardous activities. You need to train your employees to properly lift the objects. So again, lifting with their legs, not their back. There are plenty of YouTube videos that can show you how to properly lift. I mean, there's so many free resources out there for lifting training. That's not something you typically need to pay to have someone come in and teach your employees. That is something you can really self-educate on and train your own employees on. That being said, though, if you do want someone outside to come in and train it, there are plenty of those options out there for a cost as well. Follow the appropriate safe systems of work, whatever your plans are for your job place, and make sure to use any lifting equipment available for that lift. So if you have pallet jacks and you gotta move stuff that's on a pallet, use the pallet jack. If you have a forklift, use the forklift. If you have an overhead crane that can lift it and move it around, use that. Okay. So the first thing that your employees should do is size up the load. You know, how big is this? Am I going to be able to pick this up myself safely? If so, or if not, use a mechanical aid if possible, like a dolly or a cart or a lifting device. Get help if you need it, if it's too big, if it's over 50 pounds. Check for any splinters, nails, or exposed staples wherever you're going to be putting your hands. Make sure you have a clear path before lifting. So if you know you need to go, you need to go pretty far, make sure that you walk that area before you actually lift the object and go. Because a lot of times, if you're lifting a fairly big object, even if it's light, it's going to block your vision or your path. You may even need a spotter to help you out to walk ahead of you and just make sure people stay out of your way and that there's no obstructions in the way. Step 2 is going to be to actually lift the object. Make sure you bring it as close to you as possible. You don't want to have to reach out forward or bend forward to pick it up. So kind of right in front of your feet, and you're going to squat down to it. Once you squat down to it, you're going to grab on to wherever you can hold it. It's best if you can add handles to the object, or if the object has handles somewhere, obviously use those handles. And then again, lift with your legs, not your back. Okay, we're doing squats. Keep your head up and your back straight. A lot of people like to bend forward or hang their head forward. That puts stress on those muscles in your back already. If you're just sitting in a chair right now and you lean forward and bend your head down so your chin kind of pushes up against your chest or the bottom of your neck, you'll notice you feel a pain, a sharp pain kind of in the bottom of your neck, as well as for some people in their mid back while they're sitting down. That's why you want to keep your back straight and your head up while you're lifting, because you don't want to pre-stress those muscles before you even start to lift. Okay, then you're going to move the object, keep it close to your body. Again, that has to do with center of gravities in physics. You want to keep the center of gravity of that object as close to your body or your chest or your center of gravity as you can. Look where you're going. You may have to lean your head a little to the left to look around in front of you. Again, if it's going to block your vision, get someone to help you walk with it. Even better, just get them to help pick it up with you and team lift it, and that way you can hold it to your side and you can be looking forward while you're moving that object. Make sure you shift your feet to turn. Don't twist your body. A lot of people will start to twist their upper body when they go to turn and sit it on a shelf. Face the shelf before you sit it onto the shelf. Do not twist your body. Get set and get lower. If you have to put it down on the ground, if the shelf is not at waist level, get set. So plant your feet and then start to squat right back down. You're just going in reverse of what you did to pick it up. Set the object down, let your leg muscles carry it down. Make certain your fingers and toes are clear before you set the object down. You don't want to crush your fingers. And that's it. That's your lift. Kind of some administrative controls though. If you do have heavier objects and you don't have mechanical lifting devices, store those heavier objects at waist level. That way, when you pick it up and you set it down, you don't have to actually bend it all or squat down or stand up at all. It should be right at, if it's at waist level on a shelf, it should be right in front of you. You should just have to grab it and pull it off the shelf and move it. That's going to be safer than actually lifting and setting it down. Okay. Put your lightest objects or down on the ground. If you have really heavy objects, can you put them on wheels and move them around and just keep them under the bottom shelf? That works as well. And then your other light items can go up top because those are going to be the easiest ones to access with a ladder. If you have to go up a ladder to get on a shelf, your lightest stuff should be up on top. And anytime you go up on a ladder, again, pull the object to the edge before you pick it up. You should never use a ladder if you have to use both hands to pick something up, though. If you're going to come back down the ladder. So if you can hand it off to someone safely, do that. If not, you should not be using a ladder to get that object up and down if you have to keep both hands on it. Okay. Things you should do when you're lifting: lift as a team, use your legs, turn with your legs, not with your waist. Make sure you're using any lifting equipment available and that's appropriate for your task, whether that be a dolly or a pallet jack. What you should not do: don't lift bulky loads alone. Don't lift oddly shaped loads alone. And don't lift really heavy loads alone. Okay. Never twist when you're lifting. Never use your back to lift. You want to make sure you're using your legs and that you're keeping your back straight and your head in line. So your neck also straight, similar to what we see in this team lift picture here. And don't lift objects that are too heavy for you. To lift safely. I should add that on there. We should not be having strongmen competitions at work. I know that happens on construction sites. Don't don't do it. Discourage that. Team lift. Okay. If you try to lift something that's heavy, whether you're trying to show off or not, that's dangerous. It could cause an injury. It could cost your company a lot of money. So employees should not be doing things like that. Okay. And don't reach. That's what I mentioned when you have something that's deep back on a shelf. Don't lift and reach. Pull it to the edge, then lift it. Okay. And just kind of to sum it up, the safest lift is no lift at all. Use engineering controls to eliminate the need to lift or move. So I mentioned that at the beginning, your conveyor belts and things like that. Use engineering controls to reduce the strength needed to lift or move. That would be using pallet jacks. So we still have to push or pull that pallet jack, but it's going to greatly reduce the amount of force we need to move an entire pallet. Okay, so some more examples of things that'll help you there: carts, forklifts, pallet jacks, patient lifts, conveyor belts, hoists, gantry cranes, things like that. Okay, now getting specifically into carts. Should you push or pull them? Whenever possible, you're going to want to push a cart rather than pull it. I mentioned this at the beginning. When you pull something, your body is put into an awkward position, and it increases the chance of you pulling a muscle while you're pulling the cart. So you don't want to do that. Now, there are some cases where you do have to pull to get into certain areas or to maneuver certain things. I know sometimes pallet jacks tend to in some cases be better to pull than push. You're going to have to evaluate every situation in its own, but the general rule is push rather than pull. Okay, it's also more likely to run over your feet while you're pulling a cart. which leads to crush injuries on the toes, especially since most people that are working with carts and moving carts are not wearing safety toe or steel toed shoes. A lot of times we see this in the hospitality industry, the restaurant industry, and the hotel industry. While pulling and walking backwards, you're also more likely to slip, trip, or fall. If pulling while walking forward, that's where you get into the awkward position and you increase the risk of back or shoulder injuries due to overexertions or bodily reactions. Okay. Operators or the people that are moving these carts should be trained on appropriate body positioning for the type of cart that's being handled. That would come with your cart's manual. They should be trained on how to maneuver heavy loads and to avoid heavy loading when possible. They should walk at appropriate speeds. If you start going too fast with a cart, it's going to take off from you. So keep a typical walking pace. And again, push rather than pull when possible. Tasks should be designed to accommodate this. So sometimes the reason a cart or jack is pulled is because the task that they're doing requires that. So again, if any of you have been through the lean process of management, um, you'll be familiar with the idea that it's never the employee; it's always the process. And what that means is the employees are making poor decisions because the process or the environment is designed poorly. So we want to alter that environment or that process so that the employee wants to do the safer thing. Okay, so that the safer thing makes more sense and is easier to do. A lot of times when workers are taking shortcuts, it's simply because the right way to do things is just extremely inconvenient, takes longer, and is harder. So, what type of environmental factors am I talking about controlling? Things like aisles and how wide the aisles are. They need to be wide enough for the operator's body to safely stand behind the cart and apply the force necessary to move it. Aisles need to be kept clear of clutter, spills, and debris. And corners should accommodate the turning radius of the moving cart without stopping and starting. Heavier carts are going to have more trouble in corners and tight aisles. This is the one that really is where I was talking about the process needs to be changed, or the environment needs to be altered. When you get to a corner with a cart, if it can't make the turn, what the employee is going to do to help it get around that turn is they're going to walk to the front of the cart and they're going to pull it from the front and use that to alter where the front's at. And then they're going to go back to the back and scoot the back a little bit and then back to the front. And they're going to keep pushing and pulling till they get around that corner. Whereas if the corner is wide enough to make a turn, they'll be able to just keep pushing from the backside and go right around that corner. With ramps, again, you're going to need more force to ascend ramps as well as to slow down and control a cart while descending down a ramp. Make sure you're reducing the load weight when you have ramps in your system. If you have heavily loaded carts and multiple ramps can't be avoided, they do make carts that have a power assist that has both power assist to help you move forward as well as hand brakes to slow it down. So if you have a lot of ramps and you're moving heavy carts, that is something to consider for the safety of your employees. And you never want them to be backing down a ramp with it because then it could push them over, run them over, fall on them. Okay. Make sure that floors are not damaged, they're not uneven, and that they're not rough. We don't want to create any additional hazards. Dusty, oily, and wet floors reduce the ability of the operator to control carts and maintain traction. Without the friction needed, a worker is going to have to exert excessive force to move or control a cart, and that could cause them to slip or lose control. Anytime you have uneven floors, consider using powered carts because then they're going to, again, have the advantage of acceleration and braking systems within the cart. And choose equipment that's going to be able to suit or can be adjusted to suit as many individuals as possible in your workplace. A lot of times, some of those carts have different options for how high or low or how tall they are, because a cart that's really low is going to be very bad for the back of a person who's very tall. And a cart that's very tall is going to be very bad for someone who is shorter to push. They're going to end up overexerting themselves trying to push a tall cart. So a lot of times you have the option to buy adjustable carts that can fit the needs of all your employees. Okay, and make sure they're wearing the appropriate footwear. Uh-oh. All right, and that was actually the last of my slides. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask those. We do have about 14 minutes left here, so that's 14 minutes for questions. I actually realized I didn't have my end slide on here that has my email address, so let me go ahead and put that in there for you. So if you do have any questions in the future, you should have gotten an email from me earlier today. Um, that email would have came from John.Valentine at yorkrisk.com. So definitely, if you have any questions in the future, feel free to reach out to me there. You can also any questions you have right now, if you're in the live version, you can go ahead and type in the chat box. Other than that, thank you all for attending. I'm going to stick around here till the end of the scheduled time, which is again in about 10 minutes. So and yeah, make sure you check your email for those handouts. I did send out handouts today that have some good training and reference material in them. If you did not get that email from me today, it's probably because you registered last second. Feel free to shoot me an email and I'll get those to you. Also, if you're watching the recorded version, make sure you shoot me an email and I'll get those handouts to you right away. Another thing I'll take the opportunity to talk about real quick is if you are interested in an on-site audit or any sort of on-site training for a variety of safety topics, you can reach out to me by email and I will actually forward that to our training manager. So we as consultants, we do offer at-cost services for both CareWorks clients and non-CareWorks clients. So if you do have any safety issues and are interested in an audit or any on-site or job-specific training, let us know. We can accommodate that as well. All right. If I have no additional questions, we'll call that a wrap for today. Thanks everyone for attending. I do appreciate you coming in and attending this webinar. We will have many more this year, so keep an eye out on your email. We try to send out the registration link about 1 or 2 weeks in advance of the webinars. So definitely keep an eye out for future webinars. Thank you.